Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now, I visit the ASA Facebook page regularly. I also post to it, and I also regularly go to the ASA website. In fact, I'm a member of ASA. Have you thought about joining? Membership is just $50 Australian, and that money helps support ASA do their work to support animal studies scholars. So I really like ASA. I think they're a really good organisation. In fact, I helped found ASA. So I really encourage you to think about joining ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association, and help support them in their work to support animal studies scholars. Now, this episode is also brought to you by MC Pony. I've been talking about MC Pony a lot for the past few weeks. Have you checked out her music? MC Pony is a hip-hop artist. She's Australian. She's a songwriter. She's very passionate about animal rights. She performs regularly at things like vegan festivals and cruelty-free festivals, but you don't have to go to a festival to see her perform and to enjoy her music. You can just visit her online, go to her YouTube page. So check out MC Pony, Vegan Enthused. Okay, people, let's get down to business. So this week, again, I'm coming to you from Spain, where I'm attending the Rethinking Animality Conference. We're in the final day of the conference. It's been absolutely fantastic. And I've been again able to persuade one of the fantastic conference participants to join me and to join you for this episode of Knowing Animals. So this week I'm joined by Maria Sofia Pimentel Biscaia. Do you want to? Oh, excellent. So Sophia is a member of the Centre for Languages, Literature and Cultures at the University of Aveiro, Portugal, where she teaches English. And today we're going to discuss Sophia's forthcoming paper, Loving Monsters, the curious case of Patricia Piccinini's posthuman offsprings, which is going to appear in the journal Nordlit, which is spelled Nordlit, and you'll be able to find the details of the publication in the notes for this episode. So welcome to the podcast, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, for having me, for inviting me. I'm really honoured, truly honoured.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So, Sophia, why this work? Where did it come from?
I actually was thinking about it last night, and I can't exactly remember when it started specifically. I have been interested in similar topics for, let us say, 15 years at least. When I first started my master's, which was still in the 90s, still in the 90s, one of the courses I took was women's writing, and the other one was post-colonial studies. So very quickly I saw the connection between the two. But I was always interested in the more extreme forms of representation or embodiments. I was fascinated about what at the time what would be called monstrous bodies, freaks, and so forth. So I did a lot of that. And later in my PhD, I amplified my studies and wrote a thesis on the grotesque and in post-colonial studies and feminist studies. So it was from that eventually I got here, but that took a long time. So my journey has included writing about women and rats, about birds, and simians, very frequently simians as well, women as monkeys, for instance. And now I have really reached rather... I think it was a natural process. One thing led to the other, because I was always very, very interested in animal rights, and so it was only natural. It just happened. So I can't remember exactly how Piccinini ended up in my life, but from the start I was fascinated by it. And the very first thing I did when I went to Australia for the first time was to go to her gallery in the gallery that represents her in Melbourne, where they didn't at the time have any work by her, but I nagged them, and that was it, you know. And I went back to Australia after that and pursued my interest and tried to see the very famous floating sky whale at the time. I was lucky, but it was fun trying to catch it.
So it seems to me, having the opportunity to speak to you for the past few days and also read your work and hear you present, that you've got quite an affection for Australia. Did Piccinini come first and then your interest in things to do with Australia, or the other way around?
I think it was Piccinini first. Piccinini came first. I have worked a little bit on the post-colonial animal and Australia as well as a different thing, but not so much yet. It's something that I hope to develop in the future. But it was because also of post-colonial studies, of course, Australia and post-colonial studies. After I went there for the first time, of course, you know, you always want to go back, and you cannot resist the temptation of learning more about Australia.
So for listeners who may not be familiar with Patricia Piccinini's work, can you tell us who she is and what her work's about?
That is at the same time a very complicated and simple question. She's an Australian artist who was actually born in Africa, in Sierra Leone, and moved to Australia as she was young. She had a apparently fairly standard childhood, except for the trauma that she experienced when her mother developed cancer. After that, she was very curious about bodies and anatomy, and she wanted to know why this was happening, but also what could be done. So she studied fine arts, I think. I can't remember exactly, but she studied art specifically, and she started drawing the human body and its modifications like cancer does, right? And then she started developing rather quickly the very strong images as we see now. So she has installations. She has, for instance, this flying whale, which is marvelous, absolutely marvelous, although surrounded by controversy. Maybe you have heard of the controversy regarding the sky whale. It was commissioned to celebrate the 100 years of Australia's Federation...
the Federation of Australia. Yes.
Federation of Australia, and it's a flying whale with big boobs, basically. And some people thought, number one, that's too much femininity for us, and number two, how does this represent Australia? So it's interesting to think about what is this, I think, new Australia that at least some people saw as being represented like this, something clearly floating as well. So that was, to me, very important. It wasn't a monument somewhere celebrating that date. It was something that could actually go around the country. So now bringing everyone together in a way. She has developed work, as I was saying, art installations, but also video and digital photography, and they vary quite a lot. So, for instance, there are the posthuman offspring that we saw today in the conference, which are, I think, undoubtedly pieces that are not pieces. You can feel they are akin to you, that they are you in a sense, but they are also animals. They are also mechanical sometimes, and they carry with them things that are close to us. Not just one emotion. They carry an array of affects, disgust, but also tenderness. So she has a beautiful video called Tender. If you're interested, it's available online. It's really fantastic. Also to do with suburban Australia. And she has mechanical installations as well. So you don't see animals anymore. They are mechanized beings, but they still behave. They show the behavior on animals and humans at the same time. So the work is clearly evolving. It is phenomenal. She's also now doing things, the latest things, which I find absolutely fascinating, have to do with plants. And she has developed I will refer to two cases, Metaflora and the boot flower, which are magnificent pieces. And they represent a really sophisticated example of the posthuman, where you can see a flower that is clearly fleshy and lays eggs, and you have no idea where this flower came from, and again, where it's going to go, the idea of reproduction again. And this flower looks back at you, which is something we discussed in the conference as well. The object that is no longer an object, it's a subject. It's clearly looking at you. It has no eyes, but you can feel that it's looking at you, and you feel at the same time scared, the menace coming from this flower, because you can feel this flower is powerful. It's fascinating, really fascinating.
So, Sophia, you're interested in critical posthumanism.
Mm-hmm.
For listeners who mightn't be familiar or comfortable with that expression, what do you understand posthumanism to be?
All right, so I should say I'm not a philosopher, and this would be my interpretation of my readings and what I learn from conferences. I think that what posthumanism has been discussed at length, and it is, of course, a step that represents a need that we feel now, that humanism must be left behind, and that we should go beyond reason, the ideas of progress, and that science will solve the problems of the world, as were mentioned throughout this conference: overpopulation, the deforestation, and so forth. There is no great human, no super intelligence that can solve those problems. So how can we solve those problems? And posthumanism is trying, through, for instance, materialist views, to focus on bodies, on embodied subjectivities that address those problems, and instead of focusing on the idea of moving forward, it focuses on the idea of dismantling the us and them, and building a communal sense of solidarity, of empathy, and that is the way to go. Critical because we are at a critical stage. We know these problems are real. We know what the consequences are. So it is about critique, of course, but critical in that general sense as well. It's critical that we address these issues. Clearly, humanism, as it was devised, was theorized, is not working for billions of people and animals. So we need an alternative. Posthumanism would be the alternative.
So then bringing these different aspects together, how do you look at works of someone such as Piccinini and think about posthumanism? How does she help you think about what the future might be or could be?
I don't think she tries to give you the solution per se. So she's very clear about not being against progress. That would be obviously not feasible. But to integrate technology in a way that is more inclusive, right? She, I think, is very intelligent and also a very open person in terms of being able to absorb and understand posthuman theories, but not letting those theories conduct her work necessarily. They can inspire her, but I think she has that thing naturally, and she just sees the two things coming together. Now, for instance, with the question of the young family and the organ donation possibility, she's not shy to say, I don't know what I would do. What I'm saying is clearly, look, this is something that is there, it's something that is being developed somewhere, but I don't know what I would do if one of my children had cancer or had some horrible disease, and she has, of course, the experience of a mother, and they needed an organ transplant. Would I do this to this posthuman animal? So she repeatedly says we have a duty to care, we have an obligation to care, to love these creatures that are being created everywhere. And yesterday we saw the example of the bucardo that I was really impressed. The clone of the bucardo lived for 7 agonizing minutes. Right? There is a duty to care for those failures, as Piccinini calls them. Where was the care for that clone? But she does realize that there will always be this conflict. What would I do if my own family was at stake?
And is part of the appeal for you that she challenges the human, non-human animal divide?
Sorry?
Is part of the appeal of
yes.
her work for you that she breaks down or problematizes
Yes.
animals in one category and humans in another?
Not just animals. As I said, also technology, cars, scooters. Her scooters are lovely, shiny little scooters, loving each other as well, and also the vegetable world, which she has only now started to develop more intensely. So it's the non-human in every sense, but again, the human is there everywhere. It's the breaking down of that barrier, the not having that gap that is absolutely fascinating. You cannot pinpoint where one begins and the other. There is, in fact, I think, a culture of multi-species empathy.
Now, she's become very prominent, as
She
you
has.
know. Do you think that when people gaze upon her work, that means that they're starting to think about a post-human or more than human world? Or what do you think that's the popularity of her work says about the changing world we live in?
I think at first sight, there's no question that her work is striking. And that, of course, if you want to succeed as an artist, is important. The allure of the monster has always been there. So there is a tradition of the spectacular body in that, and definitely people are attracted to that. But for instance, the fact that her installations deal with things, people don't think, oh, it's the posthuman. Of course not. But they see themes that they themselves worry about reflected in her work. Just recently, I saw a photo of a young woman breastfeeding her baby in a gallery next to one of her installations, Big Mother, where the simian creature was also feeding a baby. And I thought, that's exactly what this is about. There is clearly something being, the connection is there. And it's such a powerful connection. And it also, I think, although she never says she's a feminist, clearly the fact that there is this thing about females' bodies, it speaks so much. A woman breastfeeding her baby, showing her breasts in a gallery in the middle of a room, not shying away, hiding some. So there is pride in her body and her functions and what she's doing with her body and giving to the world. I think that's why. And that's just an example.
Wonderful. Well, Sophia, I ask everybody who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I think I am.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I actually can't, which is terrible of me. Because I think I started thinking about these issues informally. What I do remember is, for instance, studying at school a piece that was called The Beasts by a famous Portuguese writer, Miguel Targa. And all the stories are about several animals, right? And they have absolutely horrible lives. They are abused in all forms. It speaks of thirst, starvation, overworking, everything you can imagine, negligence and so forth. And that book is studied by children, which I find at the same time liberating and shocking. But never was it referred to, this is about animal suffering. And it was there for you to see. This was, a class about Portuguese literature. Let's analyze the metaphor. Let's analyze this discursive strategy. And let's see, where is the Portugueseness here? So there was also that contribute to the national identity in something. But the fact that it was about animals being horribly abused was never discussed. And so I think I started there, and then I started doing readings on my own. Not, again, academic readings, just readings. Where are animals represented in literature? And I also remember something that I found also very difficult to read. For instance, a short story by probably one of the, I would say, for me, the best Portuguese writer ever, Essa de Queiroz, a 19th century realist writer. And he has this short story called Friar Genebro. And Friar Genebro is a saint. Everybody thinks he's lovely, he's a wonderful man, and whatever. But Friar Genebro one time was hungry, and he decided to have pork. So he got his hands on a pig, and he had some of the flesh to eat. However, he did not have the mercy to kill the animal first, and therefore his soul could not be saved. And when I read this short story, I was so impressed. This short story was really about animal suffering. This is not taught in school. But I thought it was lovely. 19th century, someone was there, that is important to the Portuguese nation, who clearly wrote a short story to say, this thing of being a good person is just a facade if you don't care about things like you don't even have the mercy to kill an animal to feed on its body. So that's how I started with literature. And yes.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
The first piece I wrote was a very silly thing. I was taking my university entrance exams, and one of the tasks was to write an argumentative text. So this was back in 1990. There was absolutely no context about animal rights in Portugal, nothing whatsoever. No one spoke about it. And I chose to write about animal rights. I don't know what I was thinking, but I decided to write about animals' rights. And I made a very clumsy attempt, because it was, an argumentative piece, a clumsy attempt at saying if you base the rights of animals and people on the grounds of intelligence, which is still being discussed, right? Reason versus, then surely that has implications to what we think we are as humans, and some people being better than others. And so now that I look back, I can see how silly it was, and badly written, by the way. But I can also see that even at the time, I was already thinking about things that now we would call animal studies and disability studies, and that it was already there's something. And I would say that was my first piece.
Wonderful. It's obviously been on your mind for a long time, Sophia. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I have no doubt about who that person is. It's Carol J. Adams, and her wonderful book that some people hate, The Pornography of Meat, a feminist vegetarian critical theory, because it brings together the two issues that I'm interested in, feminism and animal studies, and it combines the two so well. And I think I've been struggling for years. I had been struggling for years. I could see they were connected, but how? And it took the reading of this book that is simple to read, fast to read, but it clarifies so many things. And I thought it was magnificent, absolutely magnificent.
Wonderful. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
That's a difficult one. Oscar said yesterday, Oscar Horta, that we need to grab the attention of life science professionals because their work almost seems to happen in a vacuum of culture and a vacuum. He didn't say that. I'm saying that. And of empathy, a vacuum of empathy. Well, academics are almost all of them teachers. So I would say do it in class. I happen to have, as I'm sure everyone does, a lot of students from the life sciences. I also found out that that it's not effective to go there and preach. I want to preach about animals' rights, animal studies, and so forth, as I do about feminism, as I do about race studies and so forth, but it just doesn't go through. And I think that's where posthumanism is useful. You can draw attention to things like what is consumption, who is being consumed, who is not being consumed, what is the manner of consumption. There are grades of consumption. So let us say, for instance, people in the West will eat a pig, but they are unlikely to eat a dog. So that sort of graduated forms of consumption, but also through that, what is an admissible form of grief, for instance. So if you go, and you say, oh, my dog died in class, let us say, people go, oh, yes, that's terrible, and they talk about their dogs. However, if you say, oh, my goldfish died, they go, well, okay, so it's the little things, and you can still teach whatever you have to teach with that as a background. So let us say, for instance, you have to teach something, what you do all the time, to teach culture. Why teach something that is, the problem of technology and networking and whatever? That's all very fine and well, it has its place. But why not, if you are given, and you are, the topic of consumption to teach in class? Why don't you teach the topic of animal consumption? And you can do that, right?
Wonderful. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think that because I am a huge fan supporter, groupie, if I could, of Laurie Gruen and Haraway and Braidotti, and even, yes, Piccinini, I would have to say that I would change I would emphasize the need of the duty to care. Because, again, as it was mentioned, this conference was really good. It's not that we don't have lack of access to moral philosophy. We do not have access. That was Giovanni, I can't remember his surname, who mentioned that. What we lack is access to experience in empathy. And that's what I would change. Because the other one has to be done, of course, and we will still fight for it. But I think if we are going to change people's minds and therefore to make the non-human animal life less horrible on the face of the earth, that would be that, to change, to promote the empathy.
Wonderful. Well, Sophia, what are you working on next?
I'm working on a number of things. I have just finished a paper on the vegetarian, which I realized last night one of your guest speakers also wrote about, and now I have to read her paper. My paper focuses on the idea of becoming. So it's difficult to read, I will admit, because it dwells a lot on Deleuze and Guattari. And this book, which your guest summarized very well, is about a Korean woman who decides to become a vegetarian, then vegan, and then she decides to stop eating. So obviously this is about an eating disorder, but it's about a lot more than that. It's about violence, oppression over the animal body and over the female body. And I took the inspiration from Deleuze and Guattari, not only to talk about unbecoming woman, because that's what she's trying to do, not becoming woman, unbecoming woman, and becoming plant. So that's my paper. It's called Who Comes After the Woman? Becoming Plant in Hong Kong's The Vegetarian.
Wow, fantastic. So how can people find out more about your work? They can Google me because Mr. Google has long arms like the law itself. And I am on academia.edu. Edu, yes. Wonderful. Well, Sophia, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals.
Thank you so much, Rowan. It was wonderful.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. Now, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or, as Sophia mentioned, Google's very good at finding us. If you put Knowing Animals podcast into Google, you find lots of ways to engage with the podcast, including our Facebook page and also our Instagram feed. Finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find the podcast. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.